Are you
I can, and I can see you as well.
Perfect. So, colleagues, we are going to start. Welcome, good day, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. So,
Thank
you, Pedro. So, colleagues, welcome to the webinar, Economic and Social Impacts of COVID-19. Thanks so much on behalf of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs for joining this call today. So I have my name is Nayara Costa. I also work for DESA, and we have a team of our great colleagues coming to speak to you today. Before we kickstart the webinar, first of all, I hope this call and all of you are well and safe and wherever you are, and that you continue to be so. We are discussing a theme that demands a lot of solidarity and engagement from all of us. And this webinar is also an example of that. We have many people connected either through the WebEx or through Facebook Live. You can see the link to Facebook Live on the WebEx as well. So if you're having issues to hear from WebEx, you can go to Facebook Live and vice versa. I will be pleading you all, please collaborate with us. We have full house, so keep your microphones muted all the time, and please turn off your cameras if you are not speaking. So this will not disturb the others. So please do so if you can. If we hear background noises, my colleague who is managing the call, he will be muting all of us, and he will turn off on the mic of the speaker. So to our speakers, if you hear background noises, you can pause, and then we will be doing, we will mute and find and mute you again. Okay, I think I hear some background noises again. Okay, so this call will be recorded. It's being recorded right now. We will be sending you back the link of the call as well as the PowerPoint. It will be posted online as well for those who are interested. If you want to pose questions, you can use the chat box at WebEx. Just you can find it. Just put your name, your country, and the organization that you represent, and my colleagues will be compiling those questions for the speakers. If you are and the same, if you are on Facebook Live, you can also use the comments to add your questions, and my colleagues will be collecting and compiling those questions as well. May I go to the next slide, please? So those are the guidance notes, and just one point, please, we will be live tweeting, and if you are on tweet, you can use hashtag #UNDESA webinar. Our main account for this webinar is @SUSTDev. So you can see on the screen, feel free to also tweet about the webinar as well. So the next slide, please. So this is the agenda for today. We will start with some welcome remarks by Mr. Elliot Harris, the United Nations Chief Economist and Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. I'll soon give the floor to Mr. Harris, and then we will be following by the presentation of the UN DESA briefings. And I'll be introducing my colleagues as they go. And we will have a space, a session for questions and answers. So if you want to target your question to a specific speaker, please do so. Make this clear on the chat box so my colleagues know to whom you are addressing the question. So without further ado, and if we can move to the next slide, please. It is my honor to invite Mr. Elliot Harris, the United Nations Chief Economist and Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. Mr. Harris, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Nayara. Good morning from New York. All of you joining us here on this webinar of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs on the COVID-19 crisis. 12 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, the world faced a financial crisis that threatened to plunge the entire globe into a depression. The magnitude of that shock was daunting, but as it turned out, countries were able to work together in a concerted and coordinated way and avert much of the potential damage. The global community is now treading new ground in trying to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. There are several things about this crisis that are entirely unprecedented and that threaten to derail our progress towards shared prosperity in ways that not even the global financial crisis of 12 years ago was able to do. This one is truly different. This is first and foremost a global crisis of public health. Seldom, if ever, has the world been under such an intense threat to public health. And therein lies the first global challenge of this pandemic. Every country must strengthen the capacity of its public health system to deal with the crisis, to halt the spread of the virus and to treat those infected. Until that happens, the world will be unable to move from crisis mode to recovery, to deal with the economic and social consequences that this pandemic is causing. And this is the second challenge. The crisis has unleashed an economic downturn that is without precedent in our history. The downturn started out as specific supply-side disruptions as production was affected by quarantines, first in China and then elsewhere. These disruptions were transmitted around the globe in what seems like a blink of an eye because of the close interlinkages of global trade. Now, however, entire sectors are being directly compromised as demand dries up. Tourism, airline transportation, hospitality, and other people-centered services. And this, of course, is directly affecting employment and incomes and spilling over into declining demand throughout the economy. And unlike 2008, this downturn is happening everywhere at once. Now, I won't try to quantify the impact beyond a couple of headline indicators. Things are changing too rapidly everywhere, and our projections are fleeting at best. Our analysis projects an impact in 2020 that could range from a slowdown of global output growth to about 1.2% over the year, to an outright contraction of output of up to 0.9%. Both of these figures depend heavily on what we assume about the duration of the restrictions on the movement of people and the lockdowns, as well as the effectiveness of the stimulus packages in propping up demand and preventing bankruptcies and unemployment. But a couple of other figures give a sense of the true magnitude of this economic downturn. The ILO estimates that 81% of the world's workers, that's 4 out of every 5, are being affected, either through the loss of paid hours or through outright unemployment. Last week, over 6.6 million people in the United States registered for unemployment benefits, 10 times more than the highest number of weekly claims observed during the very worst part of the global financial crisis 12 years ago. We have seen the immense volatility unleashed in financial markets, but we've also seen the rapid response of central banks around the world as they try to prevent a liquidity and credit crunch from crippling economic activity even further. The third challenge is the need to ensure a coordinated global response. First, to gain control over the global spread of the virus, and then to stimulate a global economic recovery. Rapid and adequate support to the many developing countries that will otherwise be unable to react appropriately has to be a part of this response. The health crisis, the economic downturn, the financial upheaval, these could all reverse much of the progress made towards sustainable development over the past 5 years. The economic contraction and the loss of jobs and income will inevitably generate a decline in a whole range of social outcomes whose magnitude it is difficult to estimate at this point. The fourth challenge, therefore, is to formulate response measures that can preserve some of the gains in sustainability and that set the stage for a recovery that is better than the pre-crisis situation. For example, this crisis demonstrates very clearly the need for greater resilience to shocks and the importance of the tools of social protection that help to make this resilience possible.
Mr.
The biggest
Harris,
challenge of them all.
Mr. Harris, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There's some background noise. Predrag, can you mute everybody so Mr. Harris can?
Mr. Harris, you may continue, please.
The fifth, and perhaps the biggest challenge of all, is to prevent this crisis from deepening the existing inequalities and divides among us. For while we are all affected by the crisis in some way, we are not all affected equally. As an example, non-salaried workers in the services sectors often cannot work from home, and so they're much more exposed to the risk of infection than those who can work at home. And when their places of employment are shuttered due to lockdowns, they immediately lose income and likely also their jobs. Salaried workers who can work from home don't face these problems, and they're far better placed to weather the storm. Another example, children in richer school districts have access to computers and online schooling that children in poorer districts lack. If this crisis with the shutdown of schools persists for much longer, we may very well start to see differences in educational outcomes in a year or two. These differences extend to countries as well. Many developing countries lack the resources to strengthen their public health systems in order to deal effectively with the waves of infections that is still to come. Which are commodity exporters or which depend on tourism suffer much more acutely from the contraction of global activity and demand than other countries do. For many developing countries, the sequence of impacts is different than in the more developed countries. The developing countries are being affected first by the economic crisis, but many have not yet faced the brunt of infections. The economic downturn limits even more their capacity to respond to the health crisis as it may unfold. And this underscores with great clarity why a coordinated response that is global in reach is so critical. For if in some countries infections spiral out of control for lack of resources to fund a strong public health response, no country would be safe from subsequent waves of infection. And the longer it takes to get this virus under control globally, the longer the restrictions to our economic activities will have to remain in place, the deeper the damage to our social outcomes, and the more likely will be permanent changes to the structure of our societies and our economies. We in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs hope that the exchanges during this webinar will help us all to understand the nature of the threat facing us and what we can do individually and collectively to address it. I look forward to a very stimulating discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, ESG Harris, for your words, and thanks to all colleagues for managing to keep the microphones mute. And I have to say we have more than 600 people connected through WebEx and almost 200 connected through Facebook Live as well. So thank you. And we had registrations from more than 160 countries for this webinar. So moving forward, Predrag, I don't know if I can't see the PowerPoint anymore. I don't know if it's just me. So can we just move to the next slide? And it's my pleasure to start introducing also the speakers that will present the UN DESA briefings. The first colleague I want to invite is Mr. Hamid Rashid. He's Chief Development Research Branch Economic Analysis Global Economic Monitoring Branch, and from the Economic Analysis and Policy Division. Mr. Hashid will be also presenting the main findings of the briefing, the world economic situation and prospects, COVID-19, disrupting lives, economies, and societies. Hamid, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Nira. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I just want to see. Okay, we can see you. And perhaps Predrag, since he doesn't have slides, you can just turn off the slides. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Hamid Rashid. I'm the Chief of Global Economic Monitoring at DESA in New York. I'll limit my comments on three related aspects of the macroeconomic impacts of COVID-19. First, timing and sequence. Number two, symptoms, underlying economic factors, and transmission of impacts. And third, and most importantly, the way out and the way forward. On timing, the pandemic hits the world economy at a very difficult economic situation. Last year, the world GDP grew at its lowest pace in 10 years. World trade remained almost flat. Global economy grew at an average of 2% during the last 10 years, compared to average growth rate of 4% during the 10 years before the global financial crisis. We barely recovered from the last global crisis. As growth faltered and a solid economic recovery eluded us during the past decade, most governments accumulated significantly higher levels of fiscal deficits and higher levels of debt, which makes it harder for them now to handle the twin health and economic crisis today. The room for monetary expansion is even more constrained today than in the past. In the 3 months before the financial crisis, during September and December 2008, developed country central banks managed to cut policy rates by about 4% before hitting the zero lower bound. These measures injected liquidity and maintained credit flows. This time, they are hitting the zero lower bound only after cutting policy rates by 1%. Third, bilateral and multilateral cooperation, with global trade as one key manifestation of cooperation, has probably reached its lowest point last year since the end of the Cold War. The world clearly lacks a united front to fend off the pandemic and an impending economic crisis. The sequence of the crisis is equally ominous. Developed countries are facing a simultaneous blow of a health emergency and an economic crisis. The pandemic has hit the advanced economies like a tsunami. But a tsunami or any other natural disasters mostly destroys the means of production, roads, bridges, critical infrastructures, and so on and so forth. Soon after such disasters, people go back to work to rebuild the economy. The pandemic has left the means of production intact, but has taken away people's ability to participate in economic activities. With lockdowns, people are simply unable to work. This is unprecedented. We never experienced anything like this in the past. Containment measures undertaken by a large number of governments are working to prevent the worst of the pandemic, but it is presenting a difficult choice between flattening the curve versus flattening the economy. Domestic non-traded sectors in developed economies, retail trade, transportation, food, leisure, and hospitality sectors are facing the brunt of impact. As these sectors face slowdown, we are seeing a significant income and wealth effects, which are affecting demand for other goods and services, which in turn is depressing demand for imports. The exports from developed economies, as they're typically less labor intensive, and as many are service exports that do not require extensive human interaction, are relatively less affected by so far, but this may change too if the crisis persists. The economic shutdowns in developed economies is affecting the rest of the world, as there are and will be less import of goods, both manufacturing and commodities such as oil and other minerals and metals, less tourism flows, both incoming and outgoing. The net impact would be very large. Less investment and more outflow of capital from developing countries, less remittances going to developing countries, and less ODA flows. The sequence will be different for most developing countries. Many developing countries, particularly countries that are heavily dependent on exporting commodities, will encounter an economic crisis before they are hit by the pandemic. Many of them are already in an economic crisis. But the sequencing also gives them an opportunity to deal with the crisis better, which I discussed in. Like the pandemic, an economic crisis also has symptoms and underlying causes. We should not confuse symptoms for causes. Financial market volatility in developed countries is a symptom. Large outflow of capital, sharp depreciation of exchange rates are symptoms for many developing countries, which represents weakening fundamentals, the downward pressure on countries' balance sheets. The underlying factors in both developed and developing countries are twofold: growing uncertainties and anxieties about the future, and rapidly deteriorating balance sheets of households, businesses, and governments. They are mutually reinforcing. As uncertainties persist, households cut back spending and businesses lay off workers. Production and exports fall and balance of payments deteriorate. What is the way out? During a crisis of this magnitude, governments inevitably become the spender of the last resort. Across the world, governments have announced large fiscal measures to resuscitate their economies. But these stimuli are yet to assuage widespread uncertainties and anxieties and restore confidence of households and businesses. Even if governments bolster household income, there will be little increase in consumption spending because households in many cases will be unable to spend money amid continuing shutdown of their economic activities. It is also the case that during highly uncertain economic times, households tend to increase their savings, what is known as precautionary savings, which may make it harder for government to stimulate the economy. The severity of the economic crisis will depend on three critical factors that are interrelated. First, duration of lockdowns. Even if lockdowns are withdrawn, people are unlikely to resume full economic activities if fear persists that the virus is still lurking and will hit us again. Breakthroughs in containment, mitigation, and treatment measures, including ensuring universal access to testing, contact tracing, credible treatment regimen, antibody testing, and vaccine development. Sooner we have a breakthrough in any of these or all of these, the faster it is likely that we'll go back to normal. And the third, and most importantly, efficacy of fiscal stimulus packages. The size matters, but it is more important than that they just don't protect income, they stimulate consumption. A combination of income support and spending vouchers may work better in this case. Many developing countries still have a small window of opportunity to avoid the worst of an economic crisis. And as they shore up domestic and international finance, they must use them to ramp up the public health system that they have. Many of them are not in great shape. That is not just for the pandemic, but also to handle similar shocks in the future. This is an opportunity for them to strengthen prevention and enhance universal access to vaccinations, leveraging mobile and satellite technologies and improving delivery of telemedicine, for example. Then they should also use their limited resources to avoid a full-blown debt crisis, which can be very costly for them, and recovery can take much longer. And they can do so by reprioritizing spending, deploying resources more effectively, rolling over existing debt servicing obligations, and negotiating debt relief or forbearance. And finally, they can align the pandemic response to accelerate sustainable development. For example, many developing countries can accelerate efforts now to bridge the digital divide to improve public health delivery or to improve access to online education. Colleagues, every crisis brings an opportunity to rethink and rebuild. This too also offers an opportunity and great magnitude, as the crisis also is great, and we must not miss that opportunity. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamid, for your presentation. Colleagues, can we move to the next slide, Pendrag, so I can introduce our next speaker? So she will be talking about the, you will receive the PowerPoint, and then you have access to the links to all the reports that we are referring to here. So I want to invite Mrs. Wen Yang. She's Chief Global Dialogue for Social Development Branch from the Division for Inclusive Social Development at UN DESA. So Wenyan, you will have the floor now. I just want to make sure that it's your mic that is open and not someone else. And then please, Wenyan, remember to let us know when you need your PowerPoint to move. So next slide, and over to you, Wenyan, please.
Thank you, Nayara, for the introduction, and greetings to everybody taking part in this webinar. Yes, I would now move to discuss the social impacts of the crisis. We know that the social impact will be felt in the months and even years to come. So here we are.
Wenyan, I think you muted yourself.
Okay, now just in case you didn't hear, I would now move on to discuss the social impact of this crisis, and we know that the social impacts will be felt in the months, even years to come. So now we are looking ahead at what might happen and how policies can respond. So my presentation will focus on three aspects. One, we'll discuss the possible social impact, and second, policy responses, and third, using lessons from the past for orchestrating better recovery. So can we move on to the next slide? Yes, the social impact. Here you see the diagram to illustrate the possible social impact. First, employment loss will be the immediate impact. As my colleagues who had spoken before me had stated, the hardest hit sectors are in the sectors where personal service is provided, including all the sectors that have been mentioned. And I want to also highlight the fact that these are the sectors with high share of low-wage workers, female workers, and many in informal employment with limited access to health care and social protection. Therefore, without policy measures, workers and their families, especially women, is high risk falling into poverty and increased health risks. So in terms of the unemployment,
I'm sorry, Wenyan, apologies. I can hear background noises. Petra, can you mute and unmute? Thank you. Wenyan, you can, yeah, you are unmuted. And again, colleagues, please do keep microphones and cameras off all the time. Thank you again.
Yes, let's continue. Estimates of the magnitude of unemployment have been repeatedly revised upward by the International Labour Organization. Each week, reality surpasses ILO's early assumptions. The latest estimate of lost work hours, as ASG Harris had mentioned, amount to 195 million full-time jobs. From that, wage losses and the direct impact of health and disease on households and countries will lead to increase in poverty. Although it's still too early to estimate the magnitude of the increase in poverty. So the next area, because low-skilled workers and those in informal employment with limited social protection are hardest hit by the employment losses, and people with less resources, namely people who are already poor, have greater difficulties recover from health shocks or unemployment shocks. So therefore, we can expect inequality to increase. And when it comes to the impact of the crisis on trust and social cohesion, at this moment, the prospect is unclear because public health crisis such as this highlights the importance of functions of government and public services. This could increase support and trust of public institutions. A realization that we are all in this crisis together could also boost a sense of solidarity. On the other hand, crisis also can bring out the fear and worse instinct in people, which could undermine social cohesion. Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide, please? I'm not seeing the next slide.
Is the one with policy responses? It's on.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yes, the policy responses. So first, the type of policy responses are as response to the health emergency, so that we see increased health budget that often after countries declare national emergencies. Then we also see rolling out of packages to protect people and jobs, or sometimes to protect jobs, that is to pay the salaries and other benefits to companies that they cannot pay themselves, so they can keep their workers on without firing them during the economic downturn. And and then also there are stimulus packages to promote a recovery. And how those policies have been implemented, either through increased social spending or through fiscal stimulus plans. So now the economic consequences of COVID-19 is dire, and as my colleagues have highlighted. And we can anticipate that the social impacts are also devastating. But I wish to highlight some hope for guarded optimism by examining some specific details of these stimulus packages and emergency measures. Let's go to the next slide. Yes, next slide. We are looking at particularly focusing on the physical stimulus packages and the social measures. We see that 127 countries have so far announced or put into place stimulus packages, amounting to 1 to over 10% of their GDP. You see the distribution of the number of countries with the scale of packages. And I also want to mention that there are 38 countries at this point. We don't have enough information to yet estimate the percentage of the GDP. All right, so in those stimulus packages, we see the measures to support businesses, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, to protect them so they don't close. And also, most of the stimulus plans also offer income support to workers and their families by, for example, extending paid sick leave to self-employed workers, or extending the duration of paid sick leave. There's also some support for workers who cannot work from home, including help them with the care responsibilities. Many plans also extend access to unemployment benefits to workers who are not typically covered. Also to ease access to benefits or help to ensure that families can stay in their homes, such as by suspending evictions. Many governments also are including targeted social assistance or one-time universal cash transfers. Many countries also implemented emergency measures to facilitate access to health services through such as free testing for COVID-19. All these measures are welcome developments. If implemented quickly, adequately in terms of amount and duration of support, they could cushion the social impact of COVID-19 to some extent. I do hope that I'm not too optimistic in this regard. So let's move on to the next slide. The next slide is what lessons can we learn from past crises in order to move forward to plan our policy, to implement policy responses for better recovery. We learned from the 2007 and 2008 financial and economic crisis that back then 25% of the funds were allocated to discretionary social protection measures and other income support. This time around, lesson very well learned, we can expect higher share of funds devoted to social protection and other support measures, because this time there's actually less focus on picking out banks and big business, instead focusing more on medium-sized enterprises and people. Then we also know countries who implemented larger stimulus packages and faster actually recovered stronger and better. We also learned that many governments phased out the stimulus package. I see that. Okay, now I think I'm on, right? Yes, many governments actually phased out their stimulus spending too soon, while that's when unemployment was still rising. So this time around, how can the stimulus be implemented better? Well, first, protecting jobs is better than protecting laid off workers. That is through support to enterprise payrolls, instead of having people get laid off and then receive the same amount of benefit. It's better to protect jobs than protecting unemployed workers. And also expanding existing programs more effective than creating new ad hoc programs. They are more effective both in terms of administrative costs and the speed of implementation. And also that this time around, there's greater consideration for groups that are typically not those groups, especially this time, more protection and extension of benefits to informal workers and self-employed workers, and women and girls who typically shoulder the primary burden of increased demand for at-home care work. And also to make efforts to ensure that migrants, the homeless, and other excluded social groups have access to health care. So now let's move to the last slide. That is, how do we implement our policy to orchestrate a better recovery? One of the key issues is that in order to help reduce poverty and inequality, stimulus packages must be in place quickly and phased out slowly. So quicker implementation, slower withdrawal. And second, ad hoc measures address short-term needs, but most important lesson is that they leave beneficiaries just as vulnerable to future shocks if they are removed. Therefore, this brings us to the third point, that is comprehensive social protection systems, including nationally appropriate social protection floors, play a much greater and more durable role as they act as automatic stabilizers. Because such social protection systems provide basic income security to all people at all times. Therefore, they enhance people's capacity to manage and overcome shocks. Therefore, scaling up existing systems is very, very important. We need to build on the emergency response measures that we have seen countries are putting in place to leverage those measures for strengthening universal social protection systems. Now, since I mentioned also ASG Harris mentioned we need a better recovery. Yes, indeed, I think that this current crisis should be used as an opportunity to address the inadequacy of the social protection systems, to establish social protection floors and scale up existing programs. And to a broader extent, it is also an opportunity to strengthen the international cooperation to address global challenges. And such global solidarity to manage societal risks, such as health crisis, is very important to safeguarding progress that have been made toward the 2030 agenda. And this would enable us to recover from COVID-19 and help preserve progress we have, the hard-won progresses we have made on many of the SDGs, such as those that are targeting poverty, hunger, inequality, including gender inequality, and to improve access to basic services, including health, education, and other basic services. So that really this is a point in time that we need greater solidarity, and we need to recover from this with the view to address immediate needs of our populations, of our countries, as well as what we need for the future to build a better recovery. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wenyan, for that. Can we move to the next slide while I introduce our next speaker? And colleagues, just a reminder that if you have questions, please do use the chat box. If you are on Facebook Live, make sure that you use also the comments. Our colleagues are collecting your questions, and we will be addressing them to the panelists very soon. Again, my reminder for everyone, if you're not speaking, keep your microphones off. So it's my pleasure to introduce our third speaker. Shari Spiegel, she's Chief Policy Analysis and Development Branch from another division at DESA, from the Financing for Sustainable Development Office. We can also move to the next slide to show the briefing paper also that Shari will be addressing. The link is there. You will also have access to the main link to the DESA COVID-19 page. So she'll be speaking about how the corona crisis causes turmoil in financial markets. We can move to her first slide, Petra, please. And Shari, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nayara, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for wherever you are in the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the financial implications. Obviously, as we discussed and as Elliot Harris started the discussion, this is really a health crisis that became an economic crisis, and the economic impacts have also led to financial market volatility. The chart that you see there shows the volatility across equity markets in the US and in Europe and in Japan. And you can see the big drop in equity markets in March. That they have rebounded somewhat, but the fall has not just been in equity markets, it's been across asset classes, including in bonds, widening bond spreads, so that the amount that borrowers have to pay for borrowing has gone up, and currencies have fallen as well. And the big risk now is that there could be the biggest risk right now is the risk of a debt crisis. But before talking about that, there are questions about has the market overshot? What is the correct valuations? And reasons for the fall in the market are varied, and it's very difficult to know how much each of these different reasons cause the volatility. And I'm going to give three reasons. The first is really the understanding that as markets early in March began to look at what was happening and understand that there was a high risk of enormous economic slowdown and a stop in economic activity, the first reason for the drop in markets was because there was a fear of lower profits, lower corporate profits, which obviously would lead to a fall in market prices, market valuations. At the same time, there is a flight to safety. There was enormous uncertainty, and that always leads to fear and to force to selling and to panic selling. But the third reason is a little bit more complicated, and it is a more technical factor that since the last financial crisis, there has been a period of incredibly low interest rates for a long period of time. What we refer to as lower for longer, and I think we just lost Naira. We just lost the slides. If someone can put the slides back on. So okay, great. So in that period of low interest rates, there was a lot of additional borrowing by everybody. There was leverage in the financial system. There was increased borrowing by developing countries. There was an enormous amount, and there was increased borrowing by corporations, both for real investment and a lot for not for real investment, but a lot of the increased borrowing actually went into dividend payments and to other that were not productivity enhancing. And so, but what happens is when you have a crisis and when prices start falling, then all the people who borrowed to fund their positions and to fund their investments get margin calls. They can show financial for not for real investment, but a lot of the increased borrowing actually went into dividend payments and to other that were not productivity enhancing.
I think it's time to mute and unmute everybody.
What happens is when you have a crisis and prices are falling, then all the people who borrowed to fund their positions and to fund their investments get margin calls. They can show financial for not for real investment, but a lot of the increased borrowing actually went into dividend payments and to other that were not.
I think it's time to mute and unmute. We are trying to identify the problem.
Yeah, there's a stubborn stuck. I'm trying to unmute mute everybody, but it's still not taking.
Found who does this. Perhaps we need to take the person out of the call.
Yeah, the person named Navarine Collier has an open mic, and I cannot.
We might need just to. We are trying to identify the problem. Colleagues, please do bear with us as we try to solve.
Yeah, I'm sending mute all, but it looks like it's not always taking for everyone. Okay, can everybody hear me now? Nayara and Shari.
Yes, I think it's
everybody
clear.
else is muted. I think we are now in good shape. Let's continue.
Okay, great. So I'll move to the next slide. Let's move past this. But the point was just to say that there tends to be, when you have selling, it tends to be exacerbated by technical factors in the market. Luckily, as Elliot Harris said at the start, central banks came in and began to buy anything, began to buy a whole range of assets, which actually put floors on the fall in prices, which really helped stop the fall, which could have been much worse due to the technical issues of margin calls. The next slide though shows that go back to the previous slide. I'm sorry. Back to the previous slide, capital flows. This slide shows that there's been unprecedented capital outflows from developing countries. So as investors have deleveraged and taken and needed to reduce their borrowing, they've also pulled money out of developing countries. Now, again, we don't know how much of that is due to a fear of an economic slowdown, how much is due to risk aversion and panic, and how much is due to technical factors. But the amount that has come out of developing countries has been greater. It's unprecedented, and it's certainly larger than in the global financial crisis. So the next slide, please. The risk in the markets, as I said before, has been exacerbated by this prior to the outbreak.
Apologies, Charlie. I think we have another background noise.
Okay.
Petrag, I think your mic is on now.
Still?
Still showing
Okay,
on.
that's better.
Yeah, it was. I'm turning myself off.
Apologies, please go ahead.
And the only is to say that we have a stronger commercial banking system, that the banks are actually in better shape than they were prior to the financial crisis because of increased regulation. But a lot of the risk in the financial system has shifted to the non-bank financial institutions, and those have higher risk than prior to the financial crisis. And we just came out with a report, the Financing for Sustainable Development report, which I'll mention at the end, which goes into a lot of this in greater detail. But if you go to the next slide, please. The particularly worrisome part that we're all focusing on right now is the risk of a new debt crisis. And as my colleagues before have said, there's enormous fiscal impacts of COVID-19 on countries. The economic slowdown, not only are there increasing costs, but the economic slowdown will also lead to lower tax revenues and lower revenues, so that countries are going to, across the board, fiscal pressures. But at the same time, that this is going to exacerbate the economic risk of a debt crisis. Great, thanks. I said when I just saw muted, thank you. And prior to the crisis, we already were in a situation of high debt risk across developing countries. As I mentioned at the start, there was a period of lower for longer interest rates that led to enormous increase in borrowing. And even prior to this crisis, 44% of the poorest countries were already at high risk or in debt distress. And 25% of public revenues of frontier economies, those countries that are poor countries that have been borrowing on markets, were being used to repay debt payments. So this crisis is going to severely increase the number of countries that are in debt distress. We've already seen that around 100 countries have gone to the IMF asking for help already. And so this is the particular worrisome part right now that the international community has to immediately deal with. So if you go to the next slide, please. The policy brief and also our report, the Financing for Sustainable Development report, talk about policy, really want to focus and think about what are the policy solutions. And we need both short-term solutions and longer-term actions. So the first point is that a globally coordinated stimulus package. I think my colleagues have also talked about this. And that has to include a reverse in the decline, has to include concessional finance and a reverse in the decline of aid. In fact, in 2018, the last year we have data, official development assistance actually fell by 4%, and it fell to developing countries, the least developed countries, by 2.2%. So even though donor countries have enormous pressure on them right now, there is a need, and it's in everyone's interest to have concessional financing for the poorest countries. And actually, my guess is that with the delay in debt payments, depending on how it's going to be done, which is being discussed, that ODA numbers will probably increase due to this. The first point is to prevent a debt crisis. We and others have called for immediately suspending debt payments from poor countries for those who ask for relief. That there is a question of which countries to include in debt relief, and because it's not just the poorest countries that are going to feel pressures, middle income countries are also, many are not going to be in a position to repay their debt. There's also a question of whether this is a short-term liquidity problem or a longer-term solvency problem. We don't know the answers to that for many countries yet, just because the world is changing so dramatically. And it really depends on how long this crisis lasts and how much the long prices. Some of the worst hit countries are oil exporters, where the price of oil has fallen substantially, in part due to the crisis and also due to political issues. And so it depends on whether or not those price falls will be sustained. But beyond the crisis, we are going to have to reevaluate debt sustainability mechanisms that exist. In our report, the Financing for Sustainable Development report, we go into some ideas and solutions and ways to move those solutions forward. But even prior to this crisis, the mechanisms we had for dealing with debt crises were not adequate. There were big debates. It was sufficient. The muddle through scenario, which is what many called it, had been sufficient 5 years ago. But everyone is in agreement that with the growth of new creditors and more financial market commercial debt, that the existing mechanisms have not been working well prior to the crisis, and now this is going to put obviously much more pressure on them. The third point is to stabilize financial markets. I think we've all talked about that. But again, there's short-term actions which are being taken. And then there are medium to long-term actions. And there, as I said at the start, after the financial crisis, there was enormous focus on reducing risks in the banking system. And now there also needs to be more focus on what to do. How does one deal with over leverage, especially when that borrowing is not going into productive sectors and productive investments? And is there a way to use different types of capital regulations to incentivize more borrowing for long-term investment? And then another point, the fourth point, is to partner with the private sector. Right now, financial institutions are working with SMEs and individuals to roll over debt and give debt forbearance. Of course, it has to be done in a way to maintain the solvency of the financial system as well, so often with helps from governments. And in the medium term, it's important for the financial sector to try to promote sustainable investment. That's a whole nother issue we don't have time for right now, but another issue that we cover in the Financing for Sustainable Development report. And if you go to the last slide, please. The last slide, please. One more. No, it's not. There should be a longer term one. There's one more slide. No? There we go. So, and this is really just building on my colleagues. We need to build back better for sustainable, as I'm the last speaker, I'll sort of bring it up. No, go to the slide before that, if you don't mind. That building back better really means investments, long-term investment in sustainable development. It means more investment in social protection systems. It means much better risk management and much better disaster preparedness. And we talk about this in our report, and crisis prevention and much more investment in that. These are all issues that we look at in the Financing for Sustainable Development report. And now to the very last slide on the report. Flip forward the last one. It's just to tell you that our new report was just released, and if you can flip to the last report, and a lot of these issues are discussed in depth in this new Financing for Sustainable Development report. And quickly just say that this is it's led by UN DESA, but and our USG is the chair of the task force. It's done by the Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development, which includes more than 60 UN agencies. We work most closely with outside the UN with the IMF and World Bank Group, but we also, and WTO, but we also outside the core UN system. But so it's really a UN system report. We also bring in non-UN system actors, the OECD Secretariat, the South Center, the Financial Stability Board all contribute to our report. So please go check it out on our website. And thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Shari, and thanks to all our speakers and to the colleagues as well. Can we go to the next slide, and then we can turn it, put it. So again, colleagues, we'll start the questions and answers section now. If you have questions or want to share your comments, please post them on the chat box, or if you are on Facebook Live, put on the comments as well. We are compiling all of them. We'll try to address as many as we can. And also we'll be doing an analysis afterwards. Make sure that you put your name, organization, and country. To the panelists, I think I will start addressing one question each. So, but if you want to address any issue that comes, please feel free to do so. If I can start, Mr. Harris, I have one question that perhaps you would be able to address. Is how the transformation of the Sustainable Development Goals can be reset or protect gain to the new reality after COVID-19. Do we need new policies? Do we need new funding? Or do we need strong partnerships? Mr. Harris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Naira. I think part of what the response here must be is that the very measures that we put in place right now to deal with the immediate economic and social impact should be designed with a view to how they contribute to greater sustainability going forward. The example I like best is right now we're in a situation where oil prices and the demand for oil are way down. This is a perfect opportunity for governments around the world that do not yet tax carbon to introduce carbon taxation at a time where the impact on people's pockets is going to be particularly low. It's also a good time to reduce the fossil fuel subsidies. Those measures now will create more fiscal space to respond to the crisis. But by the time we start recovering economically and demand and prices for fuels go back up, we will have in place now a set of relative prices that will encourage us to shift towards renewable energy. That's the sort of thing that I mean when I speak about putting in place measures now that will help us to become more sustainable in the future and accelerate the move towards sustainability as we recover. Similarly, with putting in place social protection measures, that resilience that is built into social protection will be there in the future. And it does mean then the next time a crisis hits, some of the response measures by the government will already be in place. They are already funded by the contributions of the citizens, and they deploy themselves automatically. And so the impact is much, much greater and much more rapid. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. And then move on and following up on the question on resilience. Hamid, I have a question for you coming from Facebook. Which measures can enhance social resilience and sustainable development, not only to reduce the possibility of a new Great Depression, but also to be less affected in the next health, economic, and financial shock? Over to you.
Thank you, Naira. As during my presentation, I shared the view that, and as we design the stimulus packages, often we are putting a lot of emphasis on the volume of money that is injected in the economies. But at the same time, we need to see where we can get the most impact with the money that we spend. The most impact would come when the money is targeted to boost consumption at this stage, because the real problem in the global economy right now, with massive lockdowns in developed economies and also growing lockdowns in developing economies, the demand is falling. And it's just giving money to people would not solve the problem, because money would go into savings and idle money would get more liquidity, but it will not generate consumption and not generate demand. So now the question is that how do we generate demand? One example would be giving consumption vouchers with expiration dates. For example, if you give a voucher and you have to spend it in the next 7 days or 15 days, then you would demand some goods and services that would stimulate, keep the economy running. The question is that where would they spend? Because often markets are closed. You cannot buy sort of goods that you want to buy, but still with targeted stimulus packages that boost income and consumption at the same time, make sure that people spend money. If they can't spend money on a sporting event, if they can't spend money on a theater, if they can't spend money on discretionary spending, at least they can spend money on some of the more essential goods, clothing, or something that can be bought, or more food, or other items that can build their capacity to withstand the crisis and also that generate demand in the economy. And that is linked to the issue of sustainable development as well, because if the shock persists, if we don't stimulate consumption at this stage, it will be much more difficult to stimulate the economy in the short run, because this is when this machine stops, restarting the economy, because we would have massive layoffs. And if the massive layoffs continue, so to restart it, it would be much more difficult. So I think in terms of reducing poverty and inequality that my colleagues mentioned, that is a fundamental issue that right now we stimulate and target consumption growth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hamid. Wenyan, I have the next one for you. Since you are the UN DESA focal point for gender, there is a question here. Does UN DESA have a gender lens and a gender marker to all it is doing around COVID-19? I will also connect with another question that is coming also about policy responses centering migrants. If you would have anything to add around this, because in many places they are essential workers, but they are also facing several challenges as well. So Wenyan, over to you.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the questions. Yes, actually, in this crisis, the gender, the disproportionate impact on women is much more prominent than in the global financial crisis. As the presentations have mentioned, that the sectors that have been hit the hardest and first are the sectors where we actually have very, very high representation of women as workers in those sectors: tourism, hospitality, other personal services, and care work. And that I want to mention another dimension of the COVID crisis that's affecting women more, is that as now hospitals, health services are overburdened with the testing and caring for COVID patients, who are the frontline workers? Healthcare nurses, doctors. And in this profession, healthcare profession, actually 75% of the workers are women. So 75% of the frontline workers who are risking their own health, even their own lives, are women. So the gender dimension is really, it's so clear and prominent that the response to both the public health crisis as well as the economic burdens of social burdens of this crisis must have a gender lens. Having said that, in DESA, two things what we are doing in DESA. First, immediately we are producing a series of policy briefs. Today's webinar is based on the first batch of such policy briefs. In those upcoming policy briefs, we are going to pay particular attention to the gender dimension, especially for next month. We are going to issue a series of briefs focusing on inequality. So gender dimension will be featured very prominently in that upcoming set of briefs. And also, secondly, more in a longer term view, actually, DESA is working. We are also responding to the call of Decade for Action. DESA is also looking into its own work in the coming decades. How do we organize our work, plan our work to contribute to the implementation of the 2030 agenda? Gender, again, is a very important area of focus in our departmental plan coming up. So I would just stop there and then listen to more. Thank you.
Thank you, Wenyan. Shari, I have one question for you. As if the United Nations, and in this case DESA, if there are conversations already going on with the IMF or other IFIs to discuss debt of developing countries and emerging economies and to discuss solutions around these issues?
So there are discussions going on. The initial discussions are on forbearance for poorest countries. There are questions about which countries should be initially included, but I think that there is a general agreement that there should be forbearance for the poorest countries. That there are questions of what forbearance mean. I mean, there are questions of what that would look like. So does that mean that you don't pay interest today, but then tomorrow you actually pay more because to pay for this right? Or does it mean that you don't pay interest today and there are questions about what the details of that will look like. And there are questions about how does one move from the poorest countries to the next countries? Initially, the thought is that the first focus is on bilateral creditors. There are questions about should the multilateral institutions be involved as well? They have an important role to play right now in helping to continue to finance and help countries in need. And so there's a risk of their credit quality being lowered by debt restructuring. So there are questions on the details, but there's a general agreement that starting at least with bilateral creditors, that there should be an immediate standstill on payments for the poorest countries that ask for forbearance. There's a separate set of questions of what do we do with the private sector and private debts, which are much more difficult to organize, and how does one do that very quickly? And so these are some of the questions that are ongoing, but there is definitely thinking across the international institutions within the G20 and other areas on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shari. I have one question here. I will address it to Mr. Harris. However, if any other speaker want to also comment, feel free to unmute yourself. So the question is, how can we integrate the climate change crisis in recovery from the health and economic crisis? Mr. Harris?
Well, I think that example I gave in response to the last question is a perfect example of exactly what one can do. We can make sure that the measures we put in place deal with some of the trajectories that we know are important for reducing our carbon footprint going forward. So moving away from the use of carbon through some form of taxation, the removal of subsidies, that would be a measure that is an immediate reaction today to the economic crisis, but it helps to put the economy on a path that is consistent with the obligations under the Paris Agreement and the need for climate change. We also know that in many respects, part of the longer term recovery is going to require a scaling up of investment in infrastructure. Well, what we propose and what we have actually proposed back in the financial crisis 12 years ago is that a part of that longer term response can be explicitly directed towards more sustainable investments. And so one would say that in the intermediate cities that are growing most rapidly, we face rapid urbanization. The types of infrastructure for transportation that are put in place should be oriented towards public transportation, which has a much lower impact on the environment than the private transportation using cars. That is one example. We can think about waste disposal facilities that we build in these rapidly growing cities that allow us to reduce the landfills and the amount of methane that's generated from these landfills. And that too contributes directly to reducing the impact of global warming. So there are lots of different ways in which we can put in place measures that are part of the recovery, but by their very nature are measures that contribute towards greater sustainability as we move along. The idea here, the really important idea here is to keep that principle uppermost in mind, that when we decide on what we want to do, especially over the medium to longer term, that we choose those alternatives that are more sustainable in their impact. Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Hamid, we are receiving several questions about developing countries. So there are questions about what can developing countries do right now to prevent the crisis or to address the crisis, and how can less developing countries help their people while since they are the crisis is coming towards then. Yes, so there are lots of questions about developing countries and the impact on them.
Yeah, thank you, Naira. I think that's a very critical question, but no easy answer. But if I have to prioritize, I think the biggest challenge for developing countries that are not yet hit directly by the pandemic is to put in place the right kind of health response. Because this will increase significantly. We may not underestimate once the pandemic hits many developing countries, because social distancing there will be much more difficult because of the way societies are structured. Many developing countries have mega cities that are extremely crowded, there are a lot of shanty towns, there are a lot of overcrowding in those some neighborhoods. So prevention would be critical for many of these developing countries. That would mean they should ramp up their health preparedness. I talked about a small window of opportunity, and that window is probably 3 months to 6 months maximum. And this is when, if they increase spending on health equipment, health products, PPE products, training the health workers, expanding the public health network, all of them would generate demand. And that would be the preparation that would let them avoid a full-blown pandemic affecting their economies. So I think in terms of prioritization right now, the governments in many countries in Africa and Latin America already, they are not yet seeing the influx of the pandemic infection rising very rapidly, but that should not make them complacent. They will somehow avoid the pandemic. This is where targeted spending, as I mentioned, spending that would, both public spending and private spending that generates demand for certain kinds of goods and services, and improve the preparedness of very important. And second point would be also, while they prepare for a health attack or health crisis, they should also avoid at the same time an economic crisis or a debt crisis. And this is where my colleague mentioned about engaging with bilateral donors and multilateral donors and development partners to make sure there's not an added pressure on their economies to service their debt when they are least able to service their debt. And that there can be some kind of relief, short-term or longer-term, but also allowing them to redeploy the resources for upgrading their health system at this point. And this can be done very quickly, but also keeping in mind, as they address the pandemic and an impending health crisis, they can design their expenditure in a way that actually creates a more sustainable recovery. The last point that I would make is that this is where Elliot mentioned about infrastructure development, investments in infrastructure. This is a time for many developing countries to build digital infrastructure, because increasingly the economic activities will be more online. And this crisis would accelerate that online, move to the online way of doing business. And this is when developing countries should invest heavily on digital infrastructure so that they can reduce the digital divide and improve access to digital facilities, including digital health services and digital educational services. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamid. Winian, there is a question here coming from a youth from Malaysia. So across the world, millions of young people are at high risk of losing their jobs, or they probably have lost their jobs. Would you have any recommendations on interventions or strategies that could address and protect young people? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for the question. Yes, indeed, youth is another social group or population group that are disproportionately affected by the COVID crisis. As again, it comes back to the economic activities, the sectors that are hit the hardest and immediate. Those are also areas where actually there are lots of young people engaged in those activities, especially in the informal sector. So yes, the particular challenges youth face is not to be underestimated. as to how policy responses can be catering to the needs of youth. I would say that in principle, policies, you remember that in my presentation, I tried to examine the details of the stimulus packages. That's an attempt to see that, to actually highlight the points that it's not only the size of the stimulus package that matter in the recovery, it's also how the money are allocated, how the policies are implemented that matter. So in that spirit, yes, more resources should be allocated to help young people, and because the young people, lots of young people actually, because they are in their early careers, they are less likely to have social protection, or sometimes they are not covered under unemployment schemes. So we do see the positive side, what I would say the right direction that policy responses are heading, that is extending benefits to workers who are typically not covered, that include youth. So having said that, I think that each country have different circumstances and different contexts, so that countries really are the driver and the owner of their national responses, so that they know how to help and support youth in their nation the best. So I don't feel comfortable to actually sit in New York to talk about what national governments should do other than paying particular attention. And that really I want to emphasize, to remove barriers so that youth don't encounter problems when they need assistance and help, be it income support or be it trying to keep their jobs. So I think that removing barriers and making programs and benefits accessible by all, in particular youth, is the most important principle in terms of policy responses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wenyan. So I have a question for Shari, and after that, we will pose one question that is coming through that I think all our panelists can address. It will be our last question. We are mindful of the time, but I thank you all for all the questions. We are collecting them. I'm asking my colleagues to continue collecting them, because this will be very helpful for us for our internal analysis as well from what comes next. So Shari, I have one question here that I'll ask you to address very quickly, if possible. The report that you mentioned referred to the need for more global coordination. So do you have reflections already on what would need to change in terms of global economic governance, architecture, processes, and so over to you.
Well, that's actually that's a big question that we, as everyone, as you all know, there's been actually a retreat from multilateralism over the past years, and particularly the most recently, and we see that in trade and other areas. And so this crisis can either be a place where a time where that retreat and people go more into their borders, or it can be seen as a place, a time when there is a global public good or a global public issue that goes across borders, and multilateralism and working together in better ways. And we see that now in medicines, we see that now in the search for a vaccine. And really, let's hope that the idea would be for this this crisis to be the start of greater collaboration, not less. And within the UN system, we have the UN system brings together all countries in the world. The Financing for Development Forum is a place where all countries come and discuss financing issues in particular, and for the implementation of the SDGs, and the High-Level Political Forum in July. And these are places where governments can come together to have greater coordination and to work to collaborate and strengthen multilateralism. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shari. So my proposal is the following. I have a final question I will address to our three colleagues, and I will invite Mr. Harris to be the last one, so he can also perhaps give some closing remarks. In the meantime, can I have the PowerPoint up, because there is a link to the DESA COVID-19 special page where colleagues can already go for that. So the final question, 30 seconds, starting with Hamid. So how is DESA already working with countries to support on COVID-19? Perhaps each one of you could talk just a little bit, give a hint about how the work is already proceeding. Hamid, over to you.
Thank you, Naira. As DESA is a non-resident UN entity, we are based in New York. We work very closely with member states in New York and also through our partners at the country level. The work stream that DESA produces and the way we are approaching this crisis, we are strengthening our analysis of the impact, which is very important to inform policy decisions. So all our work is directed to make sure that member states have a better understanding of the crisis and how they can respond to this crisis and how they can turn this crisis into an opportunity. You know, one point that I want to add here is that you see that this is a terms of trade benefit for some countries. For example, if you're an oil importing economy, you have some room to save some money and direct that resources elsewhere to build resilience and to promote sustainable development. So all these opportunities should be taken into account as we fight the crisis. Not all doom and gloom. And of course, these are huge challenge for many developing countries. We're not underestimating that challenge, but we are also reminding the countries, especially developing countries, that they can actually make the best use of this challenge and build more resilience and also accelerate sustainable development. And that requires a rigorous analysis of the situation and the impacts, the transmission channels. That's what we're doing to support the member states. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hamid. Wenyan, 30 seconds for you.
Okay. Yes, thank you for the question, a very, very important question. I just want to say that DESA, through its analytical work, as Hamid mentioned, we support countries in their decision-making and to both respond as well as recover better from the COVID-19 crisis. And we also, through our work supporting intergovernmental processes, we help to strengthen international cooperation and global solidarity. And also through our, as you know, we have limited scale to a limited scale, but we do have capacity development activities at the country level. So that just to give an example, that our division is jointly implementing a program to help Cambodia and Pakistan to strengthen their national social protection systems. So we are also, as in our respective areas of work, we are also examining how we can align our work and better support countries to address the challenges, the social economic challenges of COVID-19. I will just stop here.
Thank you so much, Wenyan. Shari, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I would like to just mention one of something we've been working on, which is called Integrated National Financing Frameworks. This was something that was brought up in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was the Financing for Development Agreement in 2015. And the idea is what we noticed is that most countries, processes, both in their voluntary national reviews that they present to the UN on their SDG implementation, but also in their national sustainable development strategies, didn't have a financing component. That these ideas were there, but there was no financing. How will the plans be financed? And so we're working with UNDP, with our partners, again, with the IMF and World Bank and other partners to develop a framework for how does one incorporate financing into planning at the national level in country-owned plans. It's not something that's meant to be external. It's meant to be how countries develop this on their own with support from the international system, but in country-led programs. And that's something that we're doing now. There were 18 pioneer countries that initially announced that they would start doing this. And now I think there are more than 80 countries that have shown interest and are wanting to start this process. I don't know how the COVID crisis is going to derail that, but I will say one little piece that in this planning process, the first stage is the assessment phase, and that phase includes a risk assessment. How do countries now analyze what are their risks, financial risks, as well as the and mean for the financing process? What tools does one put in place early to be able to address crises going forward? And so that is something that we're doing, working with countries, again, with our partners in UNDP and throughout the UN system as one coordinated body to help countries develop this piece that includes this planning, to inform planning processes and include risk and constraint analyses in the planning process. So thanks. And thanks to everybody.
Thank you so much, Shari. Mr. Harris, I want to invite you for some closing remarks and then we'll close the call. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for taking the time to join us this morning here in New York, this evening around the world. For me, the central role that DESA has to play going forward is to preserve the tight focus on the Sustainable Development Agenda. We have received now and are receiving a tremendous setback, but as Hamid said in his presentation, in this crisis is also an opportunity, and we can indeed put in place response measures that deal with the emergency that we're confronting today, but in a way that puts us back on track towards a more sustainable, more accelerated achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda as we recover over the medium term. One thing I'd like to stress, I'm not going to be able to summarize all of the rich discussion that we've had and the various points that were made, but that in each area, there are a couple of areas of particular priority. So if we think about the economic impact that we've had, we know that we can really only start to deal with that after the public health crisis has been brought under a certain modicum of control. But in the economic sphere, the response has to be aimed at preserving the substance of our economy so that we can recover. And that means trying to minimize the number of bankruptcies, the loss of employment, and preserving some minimum degree of global demand through consumption that will allow us to have a starting point for the recovery. On the financial side, Shari was very clear in pointing out that for us, it's an absolute priority to prevent the difficult debt situation from breaking down into a full-blown crisis, because that will complicate any attempt to recover after the health crisis is over. The social impact is varied and differentiated. I think that is one of the key messages that comes out of it. Some groups are affected more by this crisis and by the economic downturn than others are. The non-salaried workers, the women who are at the front lines of the health response, and so on. And consequently, part of that response now has to be oriented towards building up resilience of people today and preserving that resilience into the future. And finally, the most important point I think that came out is that this is something that we are all facing together. And so we need to coordinate the response. We were successful in managing the global financial crisis 12 years ago because we came together. We cannot allow the tendency to turn away from multilateral and cooperative approaches to derail our attempt to deal with this crisis. We have to come together. We have to make sure that developing countries have what it takes to respond to the public health crisis that is looming, to the economic crisis that is already there. And we need to do all of this with a sense of urgency, because otherwise, not only will we all suffer, but some of the inequalities and the divides that plague our global community will end up becoming a whole lot worse than they are today. So with that, I want to thank you all for participating in the webinar and look forward to further conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. So this is the end of our webinar. A huge thanks again to our speakers, Mr. Harris, Hamid, Wainian, Shari. A huge thanks to the colleagues from UN DESA who have been working on this webinar. You know who you are. Thank you so much. And most importantly, to all the participants for the collaboration and for joining us. So slides will be online. You have the link. You can find the papers over there, and this recording will also be made available to you. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.